My name is Ylva Rodney-Gomede. I am the head of the international office here at the University of Johannesburg and also a professor of communication studies in the School of Communications at the same university. Cyberbullying, it's really about stemming the tide. It's a phenomenon that has arisen through the ease of access to social media and online platforms. Is there a difference between cyberbullying, i.e. bullying of someone in a cyber and online environment, vis-a-vis bullying in person, so to speak? Well, there might be differences, and tonight we are going to dissect some of those issues. We're also going to talk about what can be done to stem the tide of cyberbullying, who's affected by it, and what are the role of service providers, for example, and what legal frameworks are there to protect us in an online environment against such a phenomenon as cyberbullying, and what is the role of schools versus parents, for example, when young children are involved, whether they're being bullied or are the bullier themselves, and what are the role of the legal framework, for example, to protect people in a workplace environment, and the role of managers and leaders in any workspace, for example. And with me to dissect some of these issues, I have an excellent lineup of panelists. First, I have online Professor Carolyn Thompson, who is the head of the Department of Network Engineering in the School of IT at Nelson Mandela University here in South Africa. And she is also a senior team member of the Center for Research in Information and Cybersecurity, CRIX, in the School of IT at the Nelson Mandela University. Much welcome to you, Carolyn Thompson. We are absolutely happy to have you with us. And also with me on the panel tonight, I have Daniel Batty. He is currently working for the company Encode, and he is a tech law advisor with an LLB and advanced certificate in media freedom. His expertise includes IT contracts, regulatory compliance, and research on African tech law. So it's going to be really, really interesting to delve into some of the issues around the legal framework with you, as well as together with my colleague here at the University of Johannesburg, Dr. Werner Nell, who is a lecturer in law and a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Law here at the University of Johannesburg. And he's going to help us dissect some of the legal frameworks around cyberbullying as well. So warm welcome to you, Werner. It's absolutely lovely to have you with us tonight as well. And last but not least, another colleague of mine here at the University of Johannesburg, Dr. Veronica Dwarika, who is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Education and in a lecturer in educational psychology. And she focuses on issues around trauma and resilience and violence and behavior around violence, and also positive behavior that supports who can stem the tide of bullying, for example. So we will talk a little bit more about that with Veronica tonight as well. So a warm welcome to you all, and without much further ado, my first question that I'm posing to you as a collective and to the panel: cyberbullying, what is it? And is there a difference between bullying in an online environment vis-a-vis bullying that happens in person, whether it's in a school ground, whether it's young children involved, or in a workplace? I'm going to turn to you first, Veronica, because I know this is part of maybe the work that you do within educational psychology, for example.
Thanks, Ilva. So yes, definitely it is considered to be willful, repetitive, and causing some harm in the form of any electronic device. So it has to be willful, so the behavior is deliberate, it's not accidental. It's repeated, so it's a pattern of behavior. It's not something that's isolated. And the target must perceive that some harm has been caused. And of course, it's either computers, cell phones, or any other electronic devices. In terms of the physical bullying that we see in classrooms on the school, the person is right there next to you. Here, there is that space between you in terms of electronic devices. Yeah, thanks, Ilva.
but otherwise, in terms of what happens, it's bullying, but it happens online. So, but there's that tech dimension to it, as you pointed out. Kerry Lynn, would you agree with that kind of definition to cyberbullying?
Absolutely, yes. Clear distinction between traditional bullying, offline bullying, if we can call it that, versus online. And, you know, we've got close to 60% of the total world population who is online. You know, a good chunk of those people are on social media. And I think it's about 92% of people who go online do so with mobile devices and smartphones. And these are things that we carry with us all the time as well. So, you know, with traditional bullying, offline bullying, it's perhaps in a particular context, maybe it's at school or in a community, but to a large extent, you can escape that environment for a period of time. Whereas with cyberbullying, you know, we've got these devices with us all the time. We're getting these kind of notifications, these messages, and there's almost no escape at times, especially for adolescents, when we're talking about things like cyberbullying as well.
And no, thanks for that. And Werner, I will turn to you from a legal perspective. Is there a definition within the legal framework of bullying or cyberbullying?
No, I don't think there's a specific legal definition. I think any definition in law regarding cyberbullying should be as broad as possible, so that you don't exclude certain people from its application, or certain situations from its application, and then risking not having certain protections. So I think it's as broad as being bullying with the use of digital technology, online technology, as broad as that. And the concerning thing in that regard is what we've already alluded to. It can be more severe when it's online, because the bullier doesn't have to physically face his victim. And so it gives you an anonymity, where you can kind of say and express how you feel, your hatred, your frustrations regarding this person, without worrying about consequences to a certain extent. And that is also escalated by the fact that in many instances, these bullies use hidden identities, use other people's identities, and that creates further problems from a legal point of view.
I hear you. And can anyone be affected by cyberbullying, or are there particular, you know, groups maybe that are more affected or more likely to be bullied in a cyberspace than others? I don't know. Maybe Veronica, you have some ideas around that.
Thanks, Robario. So generally, people or children who have lower self-esteem may be able to not fend off as much. They feel they need to be in the space to hear what's happening. They're afraid if they leave the space or block the person, they won't know what's happening or what's being said about them. And so they stay there because they feel that's what they need to do. They may be afraid to even come out of it because of what people think about them or what they would say about them behind their back. And so that could be some of the challenges that keep them trapped in the bullying scenario itself. Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about this before we went live this evening, about the phenomenon and the increase in cyberbullying. And do we have stats on how common it is? Whether it's, you know, young people, or whether it is in a workspace, or even as from my perspective as a former journalist, I know how common it is that journalists are being bullied and political commentators being bullied in cyberspace, and particularly female journalists. But do we have any stats? I know, Kerry Lynn, you mentioned some statistics before.
Yeah, in a study in 2018, particularly in South Africa, parents were asked if they knew about children, whether their children or children in their community had been cyberbullied. And globally speaking, 1 in 3 parents said that they knew of children in their community who had been cyberbullied or some kind of cyberbullying experience. And I think it was about 54% of parents in South Africa also knew children in their community, you know, close contact with people who had cyberbullying experiences. So very prevalent. When we talk cyberbullying, and a lot of research, you know, is defined as under 18s when it comes to cyberbullying. But of course, cyberbullying and harassment and cyber incivility, you know, can extend to the workplace or to university as well. And there, the numbers have gone up as well. There was a study in the UK where I think they said it's about a third, the number of workplace bullying incidences had increased by about 3 times since 2019, particularly going online with the pandemic and people having to interact now more online. Instances of workplace bullying have definitely increased as well.
So we see that the statistics, you know, tell us something of course about what's happening, and we know that young children, of course, are very sort of, you know, often falling prey to cyberbullying, but we know that it's equally prominent in some ways in workspaces, as you say, and adults being targeted as well, whether it's a line of their profession as such as journalists, but then also, you know, just that someone is being picked on in one way or the other, or being harassed by someone from work or another adult, for example. So, but what can then be done? What is the tech aspect of it? And I'm going to turn to you now, Daniel. The layers of technology that's come into this, and that's why we've already sort of said that we're labeling cyberbullying because it has some kind of a tech angle to it. So what are the platforms here? What are the forms of cyberbullying, and what is the role of tech in cyberbullying?
All right, yeah, thank you for that. I also just want to take a quick step back on my thoughts on cyberbullying as a whole. I think the definitions given were broad and correct, but I'd just like to add that cyberbullying extends beyond regular bullying because the audience that receives, or at least views, the consequences of the bullying is far more than bullying in person, where it's restricted to like a school or a workplace. Once it's online, it's in the global language now. The whole world can see that. And also the perpetrators, instead of being an individual perpetrator, you can result with entire brigades of anonymous cyberbullies attacking a single person, which we've seen on Twitter, we've seen on Facebook. So that also varies significantly from traditional bullying, where it's typically one perpetrator and one victim. So yeah, in terms of the actual technology itself, I suppose we've just touched on it. The main platforms themselves are, of course, your social media platforms. But then there's the less traditional ones, of course, with email, your more traditional forms of expression. But under the social media, I think that is by far the most prevalent means of cyberbullying. And then the direct messaging, which is a little bit more difficult to regulate, especially considering most direct messaging is private. But things like WhatsApp, Instagram DMs, or Twitter DMs, direct messages. So in terms of the actual platforms themselves, we can get into that. I believe Werner will probably cover that a lot with the mere conduit argument. And I know Carrie Lynn wanted to talk about the actual technologies there. So I'll just pause there and we can keep that going.
I think that we'll go a little bit deeper into the technology. Something that I think is important in when you talk about this, and for lack of a better word, an expanded definition of bullying than into cyberbullying and what it means. That, you know, the fact that it's a global phenomenon, things stay online, and I imagine from a psychology perspective, and I'm looking at you now, Veronica. I'm turning to you again. That the fact that things stay and can stay, and it leaves a footprint in cyberspace, for example, if someone has said something about you or done something, it actually is an augmented factor in this. It's really adding insult to injury.
Yeah, and I think because people can view it many times and can still implicate the situation even more, the impact it has on the victim becomes so much more a challenge to deal with. You know, the emotional strain, the physical strain, just the mental strain, feeling upset, embarrassed, feeling stupid, feeling angry perhaps, feeling ashamed, and then resulting in you losing interest in doing things that you love before, just because there's this constant repetitive behavior that's happening inflicted on you.
Yeah, and of course there are different platforms involved here, and I know I think that's also important to remember. So Carolyn, talk us through a little bit these platforms where cyberbullying then sort of takes place and what the role of tech is.
First, yes, I just wanted to mention about things being put online and being permanent. Every time we go online, we're building our digital footprint, and that footprint is largely permanent. When you put something out there, we lose control of it. It's no longer ours. It can be shared, it can be put out there. And I think on both sides of the coin, being a victim of cyberbullying, but also being the cyberbully. There's cases where celebrities recently have tweets that they posted or messages they sent years ago have now come back, and where they were bullying people using technology, it's now come back to bite them. So, the consequences, certainly legal consequences, but also years down the line, these things stay online and could always come to light as well. But from technology platforms, by far, as Daniel mentioned, the most prevalent places where cyberbullying happens is social media. Instagram, in a number of studies, comes up as the most prevalent social media platform in terms of cyberbullying. And then, of course, we've got Facebook, Snapchat, YouTube, Twitter. They're all involved to an extent. WhatsApp certainly can take place as well. But a lot of these social media companies are turning to technology to try and, technology's created this environment where people can be bullied and things can be amplified and go viral to an extent. And these social media companies are looking at things like artificial intelligence to help identify offensive text messages, photos, memes that are put out there, because it's nearly impossible with all the posts, the thousands of posts that are going out all the time for human moderators, to try and wade through all this manually and try and identify things and remove things. It's virtually impossible. So we need technology like artificial intelligence and deep learning, machine learning. These algorithms can go through thousands of posts in a matter of seconds, and if they know what to look for and if they're trained properly, to be able to pick up on these instances of offensive text messages or photos, obviously within context. The challenges come in picking up things like sarcasm or words that may have a completely harmless meaning. Animal, it could be in the context of I saw animals at a zoo, or it could be used in the case of calling someone an animal, which would of course be derogatory. So training these algorithms to pick up on the nuances, on misspelling, on all these kind of things. Instagram is using something called deep text, which they're training to, look at all these different posts that are going out there in an attempt to try and, before they even get out there, try and remove them from their platform. And there's a number of examples out there where the different platforms are trying to combat it through things like AI.
So I think that's really interesting, because as you say, this is of course really, really difficult, because what could be offensive to one, it might not be offensive to someone else, but also vice versa. It's, there are a lot of, and training the algorithms then to pick up on certain things might be very, very difficult. But I'm going to turn to you now, Daniel. What's the role here of these tech companies, including, platforms such as Facebook, social media, other social media outlets, but also tech companies more generally and the service providers?
Okay, yeah. So I just also want to touch on the AI just real quickly. I suppose what has to be borne in mind, that we have to be very cognizant when regulating speech, because you did mention very clearly what can be offensive to one cannot be offensive to another. So who makes these decisions? Which is why ultimately it's probably a good idea that cyberbullying is broadly defined and it can be handled on a case-by-case basis. But we shouldn't have these are the things you can say, these are the things you can't say, and let a machine decide which is which. So moving into the actual tech companies themselves. So what we've seen in general is that the tech companies, especially social media companies, try to distance themselves from responsibility for what's posted on their platforms. Here in South Africa, we don't use the exact language, but in the UK, they call it publishing. So if you are a publisher, you're responsible for what you publish. If you are not, you treat it as more like a notice board. So what is made available on your notice board, you are not responsible for. You merely provide the space on which it is posted. So social media has tried to fit within that definition. We are just a notice board. We're not responsible for what you post on our notice board. We just make the space available. But what we've seen is that they really are acting in both spaces. They're trying to have it the best of both ways. And how they're doing that is they are regulating speech. There are moderators, there are reviews of contents, there are terms of services on what you can and can't say, what you can and can't post. But at the same time, they want to claim limited liability in that they are just a notice board. So we're starting to see the approach in Europe shifting to treating them as publishers. But what remains to be seen is how that will be treated in the rest of the world. The US is typically very pro-free speech with no limitations whatsoever. Africa tends to lean more towards responsible free speech. And I think just in general, I do just want to touch on two principles. The first one, Principle 4 of the African Declaration on the Rights of the Child, which is that in all things concerning the child's best interests are paramount. And I think when we look at cyberbullying and we look at the role of the tech companies and the role of the teachers, the role of the parents, the first question we need to bear in mind is the best interests of the child, and everything else comes after that consideration. And the next one is Principle 8 from the African Declaration on Freedom of Expression, and that is that we need to consider the evolving capacities of children. So children now, from like the age of 7 up, can very easily navigate an iPhone, can navigate a social media platform, can navigate a tablet, and the consequences of that can be pretty severe. So when we consider these discussions moving forward, I think we just need to bear those two principles in mind, because not only are they African principles, which is great for our continent and our country, but it's very topical for this conversation. And that is the capacities of the children and how it's ever evolving, and the best interests of the child.
So it's an interesting thing, because it's also being raised by the audience here, questions around the freedom of expression. At what point, does commenting on something online, so what someone has said and disagreeing, for example, then become bullying? And that's, of course, really, really difficult. There is that idea of freedom of expression vis-a-vis then what could be potentially be offensive, and it is a very, very difficult discussion. There's also someone online saying, and I'm reading this out to you as our panelists. So are bullies trying to get people to isolate? I don't understand why there is a persistent attack on individuals. What's the goal? Is this just a power trip? And I guess that question speaks to a little bit about this idea of what is the end goal of the bullying, and why does one have to take it then so publicly? Veronica, that's maybe a question for you from an educational psychologist perspective.
Thanks, Ilda. Yeah. So the power issue is perhaps one part of it. In any case, any form of abuse, it's often the person that has been abused themselves. So this person could have been bullied themselves and now is following in that and thinking that that is the way to go. Perhaps they've not learned a better behavior and needs to learn a better behavior. So there are quite a lot of factors that could be involved in what causes somebody to bully. But the idea is to cause pain, cause harm. It is willful. So when we ask the question of, how do we differentiate between bullying and something that's just an opinion, the bullying is causing harm. It's really intentional harm to whoever they are focusing that on. And part of that is the power that I have over you. I have your pictures, I have comments that you've made, and I'm going to use it against you for whatever reason.
And I then imagine that with certain social media, that, you know, it's easier then to block someone, for example, but in others that might not be so easy. So that comes back to some of the discussions then and the questions that I posed to Daniel earlier about, you know, what is the role of platforms such as Facebook, for example, and what can they do? And we mentioned the idea around AI, for example, and but there's some difficulties there as well, of course, to how do you then pick up on what is harmful, what can constitute hate speech, for example, which is also, of course, a big discussion, but maybe easier to some degree because that tends to be very public, and bullying can then happen in a space where it's maybe less public to a certain degree. In terms of the legal frameworks, what regulates these kind of discussions? And is there anything from within a legal perspective that can be done to stem the tide of cyberbullying?
Well, there's actually quite a lot of legal recourse, forms of legal recourse available in South Africa. There's obviously no specific legislation that deals exclusively and specifically with either online bullying or face-to-face bullying, but there is legislation, there is common law remedies available, and we also have the new Cybercrimes Act. So there are a whole range of possibilities when we're talking about responsibility. And in many of these instances, the one does not exclude the other. So if a bully crosses a certain point, and that is one of the questions that was asked, obviously for legal purposes, there needs to be a certain threshold. And only when a certain threshold of harm, for example, is crossed, then we can talk about bullying in a legal sense, or legal responsibility, that is. So in many of these instances, the victim of bullying is able to institute delictual action, for example, to claim sentimental damages. And in addition to that, maybe get a protection order. We have the Protection Against Harassment Act, for example, that allows an individual that is experiencing that form of cyberbullying to obtain such an order, but also to report the commission of a crime if the sort of bullying that we are talking about constitutes something like criminal injuria or criminal defamation, etc. And hopefully in future, in the next few years or so, the Cybercrimes Act that has been ratified by the president will also come into force, which will allow online publications, comments, etc., to have a criminal dimension. Now, from what we discussed a little bit earlier, that is going to be a very clear situation where there's a very close link between daily activities that we have online that we currently enjoy may actually become criminal in nature. And then we come back to the question that we had earlier, to what extent is the freedom of speech impeded by legislation like that? So on the one hand, something like the Cybercrimes Act might be very beneficial to helping the victims of crimes and stopping future occurrences of cyberbullying. But on the other hand, it does mean that we are going to give up some of our freedom online.
So what's the difference here? And I think, I'm posting that, and that's maybe something where Daniel can come in as well. So what is I imagine then that, there are recourses. If I have been, or someone that I know have been bullied online, that, there's some recourses and some protection. But also, does the law then put any kind of responsibility on service providers and various platforms?
Okay, so yeah, I'm just gonna touch on this question that just popped up in chat, and it was exactly my thoughts. I think prevention is better than cure when it comes to these kind of situations. Now, of course, Werner is absolutely correct in stating that there is a lot of legal recourse available to you. but it takes a long time, and it's a rough obligation to place on the victim rather than trying to address the cause. So from my side, I think the obligation should sit with the holders of the platform to ensure that their platform is safe. There are multiple ways they can do that. Carrie Lynn has touched on the technology basis. They can also, of course, just increase their moderation. They can be a lot stricter in what they allow and don't allow. But at the end of the day, I think we're dealing with a beast that is so large. Carrie Lynn again mentioned very, very early on in today's, in this evening's session, in that we're talking thousands of posts every second across multiple social media platforms. So true moderation is borderline impossible. And that's just the nature of it at the moment. So although I do believe prevention is better than cure, it just sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer to say I don't believe there is an actual answer. But provided we put significant liability on the platform owners, they would be a little bit stricter on how they develop their technology. They would be a little bit more cognizant of the potential harm that they face should their platform be misused. And I think in that, I'll just refer today, ENCODE released our model guidelines on age-appropriate design for children. And the first guideline we looked at was accountability. And accountability is the overarching principle in the Protection of Personal Information Act, and of course in protecting children's information. Now just stemming a little bit off cyberbullying, accountability is key. But in defending the rights of the child in all respects, accountability is key. And I think our overarching approach in our guidelines was that when developing any kind of platform, the first thing you need to know is know your target audience. And beyond that, know who's likely to use your platform. Now, Facebook says, Facebook and Instagram and all of them, because of COPPA, the Children Online's Privacy and Protection Act in the US, they say our users are not under the age of 13. But just sitting in their boardroom, they absolutely know that is not correct. They know that their users are varying in ages from probably under 10 all the way up to everyone else. So it's just about designing a platform that is accountable to that from the very ground up, and seeing what measures are needed to put into place to right from the stage of development that seeks that develops those protections. Now, what form that technology actually takes, unfortunately, I'm not a developer. So I think it's going to require a lot of thinking and a lot of geniuses in machine learning and artificial intelligence to truly pull that off. But I feel it is just it's a horrible situation we're in at the meantime, where it's impossible to moderate with humans, and it's not yet possible to moderate with machines. So we sit with the harm that we've caused in developing these social platforms rather recklessly. And there's not too much we can do outside of traditional legal recourse. So traditional legal recourse at the moment is our real only solution, alongside human moderating to the extent that it can be done.
So accountability, yes, and you mentioned that, and of course we're now talking then about developers' accountability, or accountability then from the side of the state, maybe in terms of creating the legal framework for cybercrimes, for example, as Werner mentioned. But what is the responsibility as us? What is the responsibility of an employer, for example, to make sure that social media platforms used in a workspace doesn't provide for people to be bullied or being bullies in such an environment? And what is the responsibility of schools, for example, to prevent bullying in cyberspace? I imagine that one can supervise playgrounds and break times in a school environment, but it's not so easy to supervise it online, for example. So what would be the role of school teachers? And then maybe we also dwell that down to talk about parents. I don't know, Veronica, if you have ideas.
Yeah, I think you're pointing down to the fact that it is multi-level, multi-pronged. There's not one person or one institution that needs to take responsibility. It's all of our responsibilities to make sure we are safe online. So parents at one level to educate their children from a very young age. What is the etiquette for online behavior? What are we allowed to post? What are we allowed to share? How do we respond when somebody says something we're not comfortable with? What language are we is appropriate to be used. At the school level, we're expecting schools to have some policies in place around cyberbullying. So there must be clear guidelines in terms of what is the definition, what are the consequences and the remedial actions, what are the procedures for reporting for learners themselves, and what are the procedures for the school for investigating issues of cyberbullying. And I think somebody in the chat is saying maybe we are looking at treating the symptoms and not the cause. So we may not be able to eradicate the behavior, the bad behavior, if we only focus on these aspects. We need to look at how do we work around restoring relationships that have been broken. What is restorative justice look like for cyberbullying? How do we help the perpetrator and the victim to work and build on what has been torn and broken from them? So it is multi-level, multi-pronged.
And there must be other institutions as well to draw upon. Childline, for example, where people can then reach out. But I imagine also a lot of work needs to be done from government to educate people on firstly what cyberbullying is, what constitutes cyberbullying, and how people can get help if they are a victim of bullying, or if one is a bullier oneself. And I know we've seen some campaigns being run through our state media, our public broadcaster, for example, and other news media entities in South Africa as well. What will be the effectiveness of such campaigns, you think?
Ilva, if I could just come in there, just to comment on the role that parents and caregivers and teachers should play as well, and things like campaigns. Surveys show that a lot of adolescents who are affected by cyberbullying, they don't report those incidences. And they know that they can go, or they should go to teachers or should go to parents. But for the majority of adolescents, they see it that getting an adult involved, in their mind, they don't understand the situation. It's just going to escalate the problem and make it worse. But the majority of adolescents indicate that their peers, if they could get support from their peers, that would help them in support, not necessarily directly against the cyberbully, but in not making them feeling so isolated, and support in that environment. And that to me is really interesting from a research point of view, in terms of, so much of what there is, all these initiatives and campaigns, it's often looking at the victim and the bully, that dyadic relationship between them, where the bystanders, the peers, should also understand the role that they should play in combating cyberbullying, and not staying silent, but supporting a peer, or a work colleague, or, if you observe something, stand up against it or support the person. If you witness something, be a part of the solution at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what is the responsibility of employers, Werner, in terms of a legal framework?
Well, I think again that opens up a number of interesting questions. Daniel has already mentioned POPIA. To what extent might the new act be applicable to employers that are considered to be responsible parties? If I'm using, let's say, for example, my employer's laptop, and while using that laptop, even after hours, sending messages or images or whatever the case may be, that constitutes cyberbullying. To what extent is there responsibility on an employer in terms of POPIA to make sure that that kind of personal information of clients or of other employees is not shared, is not sent forward? So that's an interesting example. Another interesting question would be the Occupational Health and Safety Act. To what extent is there a duty on the employer to make sure that there's a healthy environment, including mental health, for employees? And to what extent can an employer be held responsible? But many of these questions will remain unanswered until we have case law, courts deciding that this and this should be the threshold, or should be the benchmark, whatever the case may be. So many of these questions remain a little bit unanswered at the moment. I think the general expectation is that an employer has a certain duty to a certain extent, And if we're talking about something like vicarious liability, that could also impact on the liability of employers. But I think, as I said, that for the time being, until we have more guideline from legislation or then from courts, we are really a little bit stuck at the moment.
I hear you. And I think that what we've seen, of course, is, you know, education aside and making people aware of the problem and educating people on social media etiquette and so on, you know, it does go a long way. But as you say, maybe there is you know, we also need some kind of overall framework to guide us in this regard.
The other thing that I can also mention, to make people aware of the fact that something like sexual harassment, even by employers, could constitute something like constructive dismissal, or employees that make themselves guilty of something like cyberbullying, they could very well be dismissed for misconduct on that basis. So there are many avenues, but until we've gone down some of them, we won't exactly know where they end and what they will entail.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I imagine that, you know, these are discussions that have become more prevalent, particularly in the workspace, because of the pandemic, and we have been working more and more online, and we have more and more online conversations, and people are sort of, you know, feeling, is there a layer in a sense that the fact that there is, and it's coming back a little bit to going back onto the discussion about definitions. So the fact that you have an extra layer between you, whether it's the screen or whatever it might be, that makes people speak out a little bit more. Maybe they say things that they wouldn't normally say. Someone has from the audience has posted a question, you know, is the fact of the instantaneous communications, does that augment the sort of the bullying in a sense that people don't think before they speak? Anyone has any thoughts or ideas on that?
Yes, Ilva, absolutely. That instantaneous, being able to post so quickly and with very little feedback. If you say something to someone in person, through their body language, facial expression, reaction to what you're saying, you're going to pick up pretty quickly whether what you've said has been hurtful or harmful. Online, though, you post it and you could forget about it for a while. You have no idea how that is impacting someone at the other end, or whoever it's intended for, whoever the target is. I think in particular, you know, people just are going at high speed. They're not thinking when posting, and there's also interesting software out there called Rethink, for instance. There's a various types there where it'll pick up in what you're posting, whether it's harmful or hurtful, and give you a prompt to say that what you're about to post is potentially harmful. It could cause offense to someone. And it's shown that just giving people that pause to rethink, to just read again what they're saying and perhaps think about the consequences, it drastically reduces people's willingness to post something like that online. So absolutely, it's that platform that online, just putting stuff out there, you know, posting things quickly and not thinking it through, that I think plays a large part in a lot of online interactions.
No, I mean, it does make sense from that perspective, that, you know, the idea of posting something instantaneous and so on. And these softwares then, and I think it's interesting to delve a little bit more into both the softwares then that can prevent certain hate speech, defamatory speech, etc., etc. And of course, as we said earlier, it can't filter everything away. But also, what about software technology that can actually add to the bullying, where actually messages can be constructed, images can be altered, for example. You know, you can take the face of someone and put on someone else's body, for example, or alter certain body parts and so on. What role do such software play and that kind of technology play in the cyberbullying space?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, with anything technological, any technology that's out there, things that are meant for good or for a certain purpose are often abused by people. So as you say, to edit videos, to edit photos, to use technology to construct things that are harmful to people, unfortunately is a reality as well. So to use technology to fight cyberbullying, absolutely. There are bots that are out there that automatically, can create hateful messages as well and just spew them out there just to cause a little bit of chaos. So, it's technology that's been taken advantage of for malicious purposes, unfortunately. So we've got the two sides, where technology is trying to help, but then obviously people using technology for malicious purposes there as well. But even when technology, I think, is able to, the AI improves and, the algorithms get better, we have to come back to technology is not going to solve the problem for us. Even with people being accountable, responsible, ultimately it comes down to, obviously these interactions. We haven't got rid of offline bullying that's been around for decades with us. It's still with us. So we need to, as a society, take responsibility ultimately for it, and stand up to the bullying.
No, absolutely, and it goes, as you say, across ages. Sorry, colleagues, if you think I look a little bit funny, I've all of a sudden had a terrible allergy attack, so I'm sneezing and my eyes are tearing up here. Apologies for that. But in terms of then, so there's the software and things, picture images can be altered and so on, and of course it's very difficult to as much as we can ban certain expressions, for example, and say, this constitutes a ban, we can say it constitutes hate speech, it can be banned within a legal framework. Software, I imagine, is much more difficult to regulate because it can be used for both good and bad, and it's dependent on how it's being used, I imagine. But in terms of them, we talked a little bit about legal framework. We talked about the software that can help detect certain language and so on. But ultimately, I guess this is about education. And who's going to steer these kind of things? Can it come from government? Should it be down to schools to do it? Who should take the lead on these kind of debates to inform people about both what cyberbullying is, but also how it can be stemmed, and what you can do, of course, if you're a victim of bullying? Veronica, do you have any thoughts on that, maybe?
I can go after Daniel. I think
Yeah, Daniel, please come in.
Yeah, thanks, Veronica. So my thoughts on that would be the same way we approach drafting legislation, drafting policies, drafting regulation. It's multi-stakeholder approach. There's no one party that's going to solve this issue. It's going to involve everybody coming to the table and everybody deciding what their responsibilities are. So yeah, I don't think it's fair to say it's on the parents, but at the same time, as a parent, you have a responsibility to raise your child. It's not fair to say it's only on the schools, but at the same time, schools have a responsibility to guide the youths. It's not just on the social media companies. It's not just on the bully or the person being bullied. So yeah, multi-stakeholder approach is my 2 cents there.
No, interesting. No, thanks for that comment. Veronica?
Yeah, I think definitely it is multi-level, multi-system, and we have to start having the conversation, the tough conversation, from very young children to older children to adults. What is it? Why are we doing it? How do we stop it? It is tough to say conversations because we don't want to admit that our children are being harmed in any way. And our children don't want to come to us because they're afraid that we're going to say, take away the device now. In the workplace, we're not sure how it's going to be managed. Are we going to be victimized even more? And so people shy away from discussing it openly. And I think we want to take that mask off completely and shatter that perception. It is a myth. We want to say it's not okay. And how do we work together to put it the way it should be?
Yeah. Thanks for those comments, and I think it's interesting as well the fact that you say we need to talk about it. One needs to take away that the layer of shame as well, and the risk of re-victimization, I guess, as well. There's a question from the audience here as well. So it says deep fake technology can literally put words into your mouth. So anyone could also become a bully in this space. It might not be me, but someone attributes something to me, or use the technology then to put words into, quite literally put words into my mouth. Can that be regulated, Werner? Do we have any way
Daniel,
of regulating?
I see you've got your
technology?
mic on. If you want to go ahead, you're probably better suited than I to answer that.
Sure. Thanks, Werner. It's actually a great question. I myself am against regulating individual pieces of technology. Technology is ever changing, the law is not. So you can't regulate this single technology or this single innovation. You need to regulate the harm. So the Cybersecurity Act does exactly that. Sorry, I've got the section written down here. Let me just quickly refer to it. So yeah, section 14 and section 15. So it's the use of electronic communications devices to cause harm or to incite violence. It doesn't matter the medium. What matters is, has harm been caused? And it's the same with defamation. So if you use a deepfake technology to defame someone, having them act out or say things that they didn't say or do things they didn't do, you are bringing their name into disrepute, you are defaming them. There are existing legal mechanisms for this. We don't need to regulate deepfake technology.
And no, I hear you. And this is what we said earlier as well, that, that it's very, very difficult because technology can, of course, be used in various ways. And it's it depends on who's using it. So maybe then going back to the question of what can be done and whose responsibility is it? Caroline, from the side of the academy and the research that we do, what should we be focusing on to help stem the tide of cyberbullying, you think?
I think really Veronica touched on it in terms of, that it's a and Daniel as well, multi-stakeholder approach. There's so many areas that could be focused on, but I definitely see, and it's in terms of initiatives around the world where they get bystanders involved, in terms of trying to shut down the bully, taking that power away from the bully, in that people are standing up for the victim. And in that way, certainly amongst adolescents or at schools, that could help stem the tide there. From a workplace point of view, that's certainly looking at creating, a culture of a corporate culture that does not support bullying in any way, that there are mechanisms and policies in place to be able to report certain things happening, and that there's also, again, that supportive environment, that if I experience bullying of any kind, whether it's in the work or at school or university, wherever I am, that there is some way that I can be heard at the end of the day. So multiple areas of focus needed, multiple stakeholders involved there. But I think from a human aspect point of view, that's the way that things should be approached, is to create that culture of not tolerating bullying and cyberbullying.
And I guess there's a lot of also sort of, we talked about education and awareness as well. And I imagine that, just, in an online environment as well, what was before maybe and fairly innocent or sort of, or definitely off the record chat between colleagues is now often recorded. Which means Absolutely. That you can go back on things that might not necessarily have been, and things can be taken out of context and so on. So there are a lot of I imagine, pitfalls in this environment as well that we need to be wary of in so many ways.
Absolutely. And in creating a culture, sorry, you mentioned the awareness and education. In order to create a culture, it's about changing people's perceptions and attitudes and the way they see things, of course. So awareness is the starting point. Moving on to training, how to protect yourself, education, what can you do? Why is it that we should be protecting ourselves and others online as well? And certainly, with the pandemic, working from home, remote working, there's so much more that we're doing online these days as well, and being recorded and being documented. So that kind of awareness is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, no, I think so. And particularly, as you say, then in a school environment or a work environment, to set up, guidelines and rules for how we conduct ourselves online and what's tolerated. I've often thought about it actually, even in meetings, and of course, in an academic world or in any company, you have board meetings maybe, or you have, an academic environment, departmental meetings, Senate meetings, etc., that, the use even of emojis and such as smileys and so on can often be misinterpreted. And we've developed a whole new language as well that we probably need to regulate as well. What are any thoughts on that? Is there a new language developing in the online environment, and new words even, that might not be so easy to deal with always? Is there something that happens maybe in a school environment, Veronica, where people are being educated about what things means and these new words? And
I think there's new words coming up all the time. We're exposed to a lot of new things, and it evolves. It really evolves. I'm looking at the question in the chat in terms of asking about if our children are the ones being bullied. How do we deal with that? It's a huge question. And I think a lot of it links to blunted emotions, where things are so normalized, name calling, sending explicit messages. It's so normalized amongst the children or adolescents that it's not seen as harmful or negative. And so we have to begin to have those conversations about, how does the other person feel, or how would I feel if somebody did that to me? What is the impact of it? So if we begin to become emotionally intelligent and understand the impact, if we were in that situation, how would it affect us, and what would be the results thereof? Maybe then the bullies themselves will begin to see the effects and how harmful it can be to others.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those comments, and I think that talks to the environment and what schools can do, what can be done from a schooling perspective as well. Then, in terms of the legal framework, is there lobbying still that we need to do? Are we happy with sitting back and waiting for proper legal guidance here, or do we need to do some work?
We should never be happy. I think as society, as everything in society changes, so should our legal system. And I think on the one hand, there are a few disadvantages in regard to legal recourse, especially in terms of cyberbullying. You think about many of the culprits or the wrongdoers are under a certain age. And in those circumstances, they don't incur either criminal or intellectual responsibility. So that's one problem. The other problem is that in many instances, individuals are, for various and probably for good reasons, worried about legal recourse, going through the process of legal recourse. The trauma of reporting these instances to the police, testifying about an incident in court, it was something like cyberbullying has already had a very detrimental effect. And then putting yourself out there is a challenge. And in addition to that, obviously, when you are going to through the process of legal recourse, often the question of financial and psychological impact is very important. It may cost a lot of money to institute intellectual action, for example. But I think at the end of the day, when one decides to institute legal action, whether that is criminal or civil, you must remember that it is dependent upon evidence. And the nice thing about the fact that the web never disappears and information on the web never disappears is that digital footprint stays there. And that is provides evidence for someone that does want to institute legal recourse. But I think the bottom line in regards to decide whether to institute legal recourse is not to neglect the humanitarian welfare of the victim, and not to neglect the fact that legal recourse will have an effect on the person, but also not to overlook the fact that if you do decide to go through the process of legal recourse, your actions could potentially save a life. Literally or figuratively, you standing up saying, but I am being bullied and something needs to be done, I'm taking action, could very well save lives down the line. Because the kind of action that we are talking about, as we said earlier, is going to repeat if persons are not being held responsible for their actions.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I think that is a very, very good note to end on. It's about speaking up. It's about education, creating awareness, and pushing for changes. And of course, that goes in many, many spaces as well, because as you say, the consequences can be truly, truly, truly dire. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you all, and this is a topic that no one, that we need to discuss, and no one could have clear solutions, of course, but we need to stem the tide of bullying, full stop, whether it's in person or in cyberspace. This has been a last Cloudebate for this year, and of course we will continue and follow up with many, many more Cloudebates going into the new year and 2022. And I hope that you will stay with us, and I hope that the audience at home, that you will stay tuned, that you will come back for and listen in to many more debates and participate. And it's always fascinating to feed through these questions from the audience as well. So with that said, I want to thank you all. Thank you for contributing, and thank you to the audience back home for tuning in and being such feeding through the questions to the panelists as well. And thank you, of course, to the team at the University of Johannesburg that organizes the Cloudebates. You are always amazing getting these things together. So a very good night to you all. Thank you.